Casey Dreier is Chief of Space Policy at the Planetary Society. Hi, Casey. Thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
I just want to jump straight into this. The Planetary Society and other space and science organizations sent a letter to lawmakers, particularly the Appropriations Committee, urging them to protect NASA science in the upcoming budget bill. And as you know, a bipartisan group of lawmakers also sent a letter to the Appropriations Committee, urging them to protect NASA science in the upcoming budget bill as well. These cuts that they are proposing, what NASA science programs and missions are at risk of being cut?
Yeah. Well, NASA science, just to step back, NASA science kind of does everything that you hear about that isn't humans in space. It is the James Webb Space Telescope. It is the Hubble Space Telescope. It's the rovers on Mars. It's the missions at Pluto. It's the missions that observe Earth's climate and the sun. It's everything that returns kind of a scientific purpose. This is roughly a third of the size of NASA. It's the most successful, I'd say, unique endeavor that NASA does. There's no commercial role for space science. And so what NASA does or doesn't do with its science budget, basically has large repercussions for not just the nation, but the world, because there's no one else to do it. The proposal this year from the White House is to actually take that budget, that one third of NASA, and literally cut it in half, a 47% cut. And that's historic, right? There's never been that large of a single year cut ever proposed. And of course, that would just decimate the projects. It would require turning off 20 space missions in space now that are returning good science, literally just turning them off and letting them tumble into the darkness. That's not an exaggeration. It turns off basically the pipeline of future missions that are under development. And there would be nothing coming down the pipeline in 5 years. And so it would grind our efforts that we've started since 1962 to explore the solar system, the cosmos, our own planet. It functionally would grind those to a halt in the next 5 years. So it's a catastrophic budget. Congress actually completely rejected this for the most part, which is, this is the president's own party. But during a continuing resolution, generally the budget office will only drip out money at the rate equivalent to the lowest of all possible budget potentials. And so because it's such an extreme budget and because it's such an extreme cut, you would still potentially face these mission terminations and cutoffs, things that you wouldn't able to come back from. So it could be really bad. This is why we're really concerned about it during a CR, and this is why a number of members of Congress share that concern with us.
That's interesting. Has there been any conversations with the administration about these cuts, and have they even responded to the letter that you all sent?
No, I mean, there's more to this budget beyond even the massive cuts to science. They have a pretty dramatic reconstruction of the human spaceflight program, shifting towards Mars with kind of a questionable set of goals and detail. And, these cuts are, to technology, to educate. They completely zero out education and outreach at NASA. It is a really dramatic budget. And they've done functionally no outreach, certainly not to the public, but not even really to Congress. And this is, again, why you've seen, again, members of their own party that control both houses largely rejecting this. And so that's what's so surprising about this, is that for such a dramatic set of proposals, NASA itself had no real input into them, and then the administration had no real plan to sell it. They were just kind of muscling it through. So there hasn't been really any justification presented beyond this kind of tautological claim that, oh, we can't afford it anymore, so we're not going to do it.
Hmm. And I know these proposed cuts, they haven't happened yet, the cuts that we're talking about, but are we starting to see any impacts or ramifications just of even talks about there being potential cuts? What are astronomers and scientists telling you all?
Absolutely, there's already ramifications. The first is, if you're a young student thinking about pursuing a career in astronomy or planetary science or earth science, you start to question whether there's a future for you, because will government funding be that supports training, and will there be missions to have data? Will there be anything to do? You're seeing a decline of universities around the country are not accepting graduate students or postdoctorate researchers because they don't know if the funding will be there. The other consequence we're seeing is a severe slowing of the actual granting of scientific research support this year already, through a number of internal bureaucratic hurdles that the administration is setting up. You've seen this at the NIH and the NSF, and it's hitting NASA science as well. And then longer term, or bigger term, I should say, our allies. A lot of these projects that NASA proposed, or the White House proposed to cancel, are with European Space Agency, with the Japanese Space Agency, with countries around the world that used to think of the United States as a reliable partner. in space. And what it's causing among them is to pull back and say, we can no longer trust the United States or NASA to be this partner. We're going to have to develop our own independent capabilities and no longer work with the United States on this. So you're already seeing repercussions of this. And then, of course, just the general huge waste of time and uncertainty that will these people, can these missions do the science, or are they going to be shut down? Will the people be able to focus on the job they're supposed to do? Or will they even have a job tomorrow? And so it's hugely disruptive.
That's incredible. And I just want to take a step back here for a few minutes to really underscore these cuts that you were talking about, so people can really understand the impact that we're talking about here. The fiscal year 2026 budget request that was released by the White House in May would reduce funding for NASA by about 24% overall, from nearly 25 billion to nearly 19 billion, and a 47% cut to NASA science, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Do you think the current budget levels and even the previous budget levels that NASA has been operating under, which have kind of been relatively the same in recent years, do you think that's enough, or do you think it should be more money?
I like space, so I think there should be more resources for it. I mean, it's important to frame this, right? $25 billion, I would love to have that much money, right? I wouldn't know what to do with myself. But in terms of government spending, right, every year the U.S. government spends on the order of $5 to $6 trillion, right? And so NASA, as a percentage of what the government spends, is less than 0.5%. So it's it's a little sliver of a rounding error. The investments that we get from that are really significant. The other question that people frequently ask is, well, don't we have a commercial? Can SpaceX just do it instead? The commercial sector will do it. They've helped lower the cost of launching rockets. They've built communication satellites. But, there's no marketplace for sending a mission to Jupiter to look for life on the ocean moon of Europa. There's no marketplace for building a space telescope to peer back further in time than we've ever done before. This is why we have a public space sector. And so there's no real replacement for this. The budget cut, just to put this in another way to frame this, $18 billion or $19 billion, that sounds, again, like a decent chunk of money. But if you adjust for inflation, the last time NASA had $19 billion in today's dollars to work with would have been 1961. That was the last time NASA's budget would be that low. That is before we started the Apollo program. That is before we actually sent the first humans into space. NASA had that budget, fiscal year 1961, which began in 1960. And so this is a dramatic decrease in resources that, of course, there's going to be massive disruptions. And of course, you're doing it over the course of 1 year or less than 1 year. There's no easy or efficient way to do that, right? It is by definition wasteful to change things that dramatically.
Okay, so thank you for explaining that. With what you just said, why would the administration, with all of these projects and missions that are coming up, and even the ones that are ongoing, why would the administration want to make these type of cuts in the first place? I mean, these things aren't free. Even when you're talking about one day putting a nuclear reactor on the moon, which is something the administration has talked about, and they have a very quick timeline in how they want to do this, which is in by 2030. Mm-hmm. Nuclear reactors don't grow on trees. So, why would they want to do this?
I mean, that's kind of at the core of this, right? And because there's been no engagement on this, there's been no deeper explanation. I can give a few kind of interpretations of what's happening, ranging from the most generous to, I think, more realistic. Most generous, we can say, is that the administration sees space as purely utilitarian. So what can we get from space geopolitically, economically, that will give us something, right? Something countable and measurable. Money or power or influence or wins, right, to kind of chalk up on the leaderboard. And so there's a big investment in human spaceflight. There's kind of this rapid flip to Mars that isn't, we don't have the time to go into why that isn't really feasible, but they talk about this. And there's this now claim to say we're in this new space race against China, and China's is sending their astronauts to the moon, and the U.S. needs to beat them back there, and so forth. But at the same time, then it doesn't even make sense why you would then completely pull back on all where the U.S. does have this dominant position in sending missions out beyond the solar system and into deep space, the scientific dominance. And at the end of the day, I think it comes back to the person who runs the budget office, Russ Vought, proposed 3 years ago during his time out of power when Biden was president, saying if I were running the budget, this is literally his whole kind of alternative budget for the United States. He said, I would cut NASA's budget, science budget by 50%. And I would cut NASA by 15%. That's literally, I mean, he called this shot 3 years ago, right? And so this has nothing to do with facts on the ground. It has nothing to do with any sort of, determined policy process that came out of this. This is clearly, to me, the result of the interest of one person who has, at the moment, this level of influence within this President Trump's kind of raucous coalition of MAGA types. And so it doesn't make sense. It doesn't help us, because it's not a process that is designed to result in that output. This is this saying a person, for whatever reason, and we're seeing this obviously across government, this fundamental attack on investments in science in the country. And this is a version of that.
When you start talking about dollars, and when the dollars don't start making sense, it all doesn't add up, right? And I do want to note that Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was signed into law, it allocated nearly 10 billion in additional funding for NASA through 2022, including for the backing of Mars missions and plans to return to the moon. But even then, we're talking about money. Is that enough money? And what are your thoughts on why they would ask for that particular amount to be allocated, especially in that way? So, do you see that as kind of, oh, we're going to give 10 billion here, but we still want to make the cuts in the overall budget bill, for NASA's budget? Or, what is the rationale you think was going into that there?
Yeah, this additional layer of confusion with the separate budget bill that went through. The important thing to remember with that is that this additional 10 billion for NASA was not a proposal of the White House. This came from Ted Cruz, the senator of Texas. What's in Texas? Johnson Space Center, right? The epicenter of human spaceflight that is running. And what did they do with this money? They actually funded all the things that the White House proposed to cancel in human spaceflight. The big government-built rocket, the Space Launch System, their Orion crew capsule, this Gateway space station, all of these existing lunar exploration components, all for human spaceflight, by the way, plus some kind of sweeteners for infrastructure build-outs of NASA centers in, human spaceflight, NASA centers, which all happen to be these days in Republican-controlled states in the South. The consequence of that, obviously, is that now they immediately, in a sense, rejected these proposals to change up the human spaceflight side of NASA. They did not touch the science side, unfortunately. So the White House's proposals are still the fundamental driving force here. But through this other process, the more kind of annual process, Congress seems ready to reject those largely as well. And it's just going to come down to what we've seen, this dynamic of this administration this time around, is that they're trying to outpace the rate of politics, right? That the administration can move a lot faster than the legislative branch can. And the trick is, and the hope is, what we're trying to do is prevent any changes or consequences from what their administrative actions are from not being undoable, right? That can be fixed by the legislative branch, because it's coming, theoretically, right? And that's where we're trying to head this off.
When we talk about the impact of this, I previously reported that nearly 4,000 NASA employees have opted to leave the agency through the Trump administration's deferred resignation program. And, just laying this out in plain terms, that amounts to an estimated 20% of NASA's workforce, which is essentially reducing the agency from 18,000 to 14,000 employees. And that was the number as of July. And so there may be more people than that, now, a few months later. And when I asked, NASA about, the impact of this, they didn't respond to my questions about how the workforce cuts would affect the agency in the upcoming missions, but they did say, quote, safety remains a top priority for our agency. This many people leaving NASA, what kind of impact will that have on the agency? And, is it dangerous? How bad is that? I think, some people may think, to me, when you hear the numbers, 4,000 people, that's a lot of people. We're not sure what departments within NASA these people left from, how many left out of one department more than the other. But 4,000 people is a significant number of people.
Yeah, it is. It's, I think of the show, The Leftovers, where, 3% of the world's population just disappeared. It's like a fifth of NASA's workforce just got raptured, right, in the last couple of months. And of course, that's going to have massive shock and consequences. The any business that loses that many people that fast would be on a going out of business trend, right? That no healthy business sheds that many people that fast. The consequences of this, and you're right, NASA has not shared much details about where they're coming from. Some has leaked out. The vast majority of those individuals who chose to leave were in the skilled technical, managerial, and scientific fields, right? The very things that we need NASA to do. And who didn't leave was the administrative level that the administration says they're trying to thin out and make more efficient, right? So because there's this mad rush to kind of push as many people out of government as possible, you've actually left a lot of agencies like NASA with a higher administrative to actual skilled employee bloat. That doesn't make any sense, right? There was just, again, indicative that there's no larger strategy at play here. The issue with consequences and safety, a lot of people tie the Columbia shuttle disaster in 2003 to the consequences of a sustained, NASA shed about 20% of its workforce in the 1990s. That was very different. That happened over the course of 5 years. It was supported with an act of Congress. It was much more gradual. But at the end of the day, you still had a much smaller agency. And so a lot of people tied the Columbia disaster to lapses of an overstretched and overworked remaining workforce as a consequence of that. And so there's a lot of worry about this going forward. We honestly just do not know because this has never happened before, right? This is a shock to the workforce. I told you earlier about the comparison in terms of just available like dollars if you adjust for inflation to the last time NASA had that many. If you do the same thing with people, if you look at the last time NASA had roughly 13 to 14,000 civil servant employees, that was 1959, 1960. So that, again, before spaceflight, before humans had gone into space. And if you then think about what is the administration on paper asking NASA to do, send humans back to the moon and send now humans to Mars. But here is, you have the money and resources and number of people working for you that you last had, before microwaves or, before color TV was a thing. That makes no sense. And it's destined to fail. They're setting NASA up to fail with this. And it just doesn't, the people who remain at the agency, they're not any less dedicated. They're not any less committed to what they're doing, but they have so much now stacked against them. Plus this overwhelming culture of, will I have a distrust and fear in some cases? Will I have a job? If I speak out, will I be fired? Will I have if I say anything that I'm worried about in this plan to beat China back to the moon, will I have a job tomorrow? That's not a good culture to work in. So there's a lot of concern about that. That's very legitimate, which is why, again, you don't do these things generally if you're really serious about this stuff.
We've talked about the impact that these proposed cuts will have, to science as well as, the agency. But what about, everyday people who
Yeah.
love space and who are interested in space and science and go to the museums and like to go and, look at, rockets and that sort of thing at, a lot of these museums, how will this impact, everyday
Yeah.
people, even those who don't go to museums, but even those who just want to get a telescope and just stargaze and just
Yeah.
look up at the night sky and just see what's out there?
I mean, if you're just scrolling through Instagram and you suddenly see the Hubble Deep Field image of thousands and thousands of galaxies, stretching back billions of years, right? We have all grown up, all of us, in this with NASA as a certain thing. This intentional representation of an ideal, right? This ideal of our best values, of curiosity, of intellectual values, of cooperation to build these big complex things, of tenacity to do this over decades and do really impossible sounding things like land a rover on Mars. That type of NASA and what it gives back to us, these moments of the sublime, these moments of awe, these moments of wonder and excitement and pride, and these things of look what we can do together. I remember very vividly the first rocket launch I saw. I was struck by the experience, but also the fact that so many thousands of people had come to do so much work to put a little tiny thing in the top of this big giant bomb, basically, just to go to this little red point in the sky and say, what's going on there? Like, that's a really, that's the kind of nation and world I want to live in, is that we do more of that. And this budget and this proposal, this vision for NASA, basically says this isn't worth doing anymore. And that may not have immediate impacts for a lot of people, but what it starts to do, I think, is that we would start to notice and that it would continue to erode this sense of meaning and optimism and forward-looking nature that I think is really valuable and important for any dynamic culture to have, right? That you want to be looking up and out instead of down and in. And if we literally, I mean, this is figuratively, but I mean, this, you couldn't ask for a more powerful symbol here. Like this budget is literally saying, you know, these telescopes and things are eyes out. Turn them all off. They don't matter anymore. And that level of just closing, we have the capability to, it's like hiking up to the top of a canyon and seeing this whole huge vista laying before you and going like, what if I just go back home? And that will start to eat away at us. And I think we'll lose something really important in terms of our self-awareness and self-identity. And I really hope that doesn't happen. And we're trying to make that not happen.
We grew up, have seen these beautiful and stunning images that have come from these telescopes, and even the excitement of being able to capture what a black hole looks like, during our lifetime, right? Like those are some of the cool things that have come out of NASA and collaborations with other space agencies around the world, being
Yep.
able to really give us a really clear picture of what is around our marble looking planet that we all live on. And so, one of the last things I want to ask you is about the Day of Action to Save NASA Science that is taking place next month. Tell us a little bit about that and what we can expect.
Yeah. So one of the things we do at the Planetary Society, we're not a professional organization. We don't represent people who make money in the space business. I don't make any money by what we advocate for and care about. Right? We're just professional fans, and anyone, we're a public organization. Anyone can join us. But something we really like to do is say, be a part of this process. NASA, it's a public agency. We have representatives. If you care about this, even if you just like those pictures we just talked about, even if you like the idea of exploring galaxies or the pictures of the black holes or vistas of the Martian surface, this is our tax dollars. This is our policies. We have a right to say what we care about. And so we try to organize and educate and invigorate people around the country to go and just talk about how great space is and space science and exploration. And that NASA, as the way that it's conceived, does represent something unique and profound and is worth protecting. And so part of this is that we're getting a bunch of people to come with us to Washington, D.C. We have over 200 people who'll be coming next month on October 5th and 6th. And we go and directly talk to their members of Congress and representatives. And you know what? Most of them love to talk to us because it's they like space too. Like, no one is against space. Like maybe one or two weirdos, but there's like people really excited about this stuff. And it's more of an issue of making sure that among everything else that's happening, we keep our eye on the ball with this and say we need to, Congress is in a sense doing the right thing in this area broadly, and we need to get that across the finish line. And so giving people that empowerment and voice to come and say that, and you don't have to be a space scientist, you don't have to have an engineering degree, you don't have to be a PhD. You're anyone. You enjoy the pictures? Great. You're welcome, right, to come and join us. And so that's the kind of thing we try to do at the Planetary Society. And we found very positive experiences with that. So that's what we're doing next month. In our last big, leave it all out in the field as this new fiscal year starts to really make sure that this stuff gets protected.
And those who are watching this and they're like, wow, I love space. I love going out with my telescope at night. I love going to the museums. I like going and looking at the space shuttles that are in museums around the country. And they're hearing this and they're thinking, wow, what can I do? What can I do to help prevent these cuts from happening? Because we're seeing a lot of people that want to get involved. To me, it seems like more now than ever, just everyday people, wanting to get involved and really have their voices heard for their lawmakers. So what can people do?
Planetary.org is the easiest way. Check out the stuff. We have a ton of resources meant to get you up to speed. You can easily write. You can easily call. If you want, you can come to Washington, D.C. with us. The important thing with this is that space, very broadly still, it's being nipped at on the edges, but space and space science even and space exploration is still nonpartisan. It's not polarized. And so there's real opportunity here. And we've seen real progress. It doesn't, so if you have, it doesn't matter that Republicans are in the White House and the Congress on this because the congressional Republicans do not agree with this proposal. We made incredible strides with them. It is a unifying idea still. And so if you want to do something that is not hopeless, it is not pointless, it is actually the opposite of both of those. And it's quite addictive in a sense, and it gets you, I think, everyone a taste for it. If you've never engaged in the political process, it's a great place to start, and maybe inspire you to continue engaging in the political process for other issues that are besetting us around the country right now.
Casey Dreier, Chief of Space Policy at the Planetary Society. Thank you so much for joining me.
It was a delighted experience to be here. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.